The last thing I have to do is mount the electrical circuit. I am going to run the motor on this, as I've probably said 10 times by now, and that means we do need some sort of circuit to start the engine. Now I'm not going to the extent of having a self-contained fuel unit and battery and everything on a nice little cart. They can just sit on the ground. But I do want to permanently mount the switch and coil and things like that. My plan is to basically just make a plate here, and then I will screw whatever I need to that plate. Let's quickly talk about what I actually need to make this motor fire. In its simplest form, we can make a circuit like this. Let's just call this the motor. Now, attached to the side of the motor, of course, we have the distributor. Down here somewhere, we have the starter motor. Now, of course, we need a battery. In theory, the only other external component we need is the coil. The coil, of course, converts the battery's low voltage into high voltage for use by the distributor to send spark to the spark plugs. So here's all we need to do in theory. From the positive terminal, run one single small wire to the coil. The coil is connected to the distributor with a big fat cable, one of these, and also connected to the condenser in the distributor via a thin wire. This is part of the standard wiring in the car anyway. Now, somewhere along the line the motor has to be earthed, and obviously so does the battery. All we actually have to do is connect the motor to earth. In our case, we can simply just hook it up to the negative terminal on the battery. This can be connected anywhere on the motor. In reality, it's connected off the starter motor, since that's where the biggest current draw is. And that's it. With this circuit, the motor will run. But we need power to start the starter motor. So for that, we need a big chunky red power cable from here to the positive terminal. But this is only connected while we're cranking the engine over. Let's get a little fancy. So those two, along with the big fat earth, that's all you need to make a motor run. And this wire going to the starter, you only need to connect that to crank the starter. After that, it can be released. And for the sake of just cranking over a motor that you've got sitting on the floor in the garage, this is perfectly adequate. You can just connect this with vice grips. However, you could improve this. So this is the obvious thing to do. We could easily put a switch in here, the ignition switch, and a switch here, the start switch. And you could definitely do this for setting up the motor to run. The downside to this setup is that this switch has to then carry the full current going to the starter motor, which is basically everything the battery can give it. This isn't how motors are wired up in reality, and we're going to do it more how the motor was set up in the vehicle. Okay, so our circuit is going to be more realistic in the sense that we'll be using a solenoid. Now what a solenoid does is basically takes a small amount of current into here. It's earthed through the fixing. So it takes a small normal 12 volt switch into here, And when that is live, it connects these two terminals. And these are big mofos that are capable of carrying the current from the battery to the starter motor. So, it looks like this. This is our battery again. And let's put our solenoid here. Solenoid, I guess. So this is basically our circuit now. We have a big fat wire that goes from here to here, and a big fat wire that goes from the starter motor to the other terminal on the solenoid. Our motor will be earthed. This is earthed. So effectively, when we get small current through here, this is a switch that will close. Now, the other big thing we've got going on our motor, of course, and every motor, is the alternator. Now this gets a little complicated. The alternator actually has 3 wires coming off it, but I'll just draw 2 to keep the diagram simple. The alternator, by the way, is earthed through the motor, through its fixings. So, we have the charge wires. And they happen to be connected to the positive terminal of the solenoid. They could be connected directly to the battery, but this terminal happens to be a convenient place to fix wires. As you can see, it's effectively the same as if it were connected to the battery. Okay, so now here is where we're going to pull the wire off the solenoid to switch the solenoid. Now also coming off the alternator, we have this third wire. Remember, this is a double, I've shown it single. We have this third wire that basically powers the other bits and pieces in the vehicle, like everything on the dashboard, etc. So we're going to use that for our switch, for our start switch. Okay, so this is the switch. Now when we close this switch, that means we will be getting 12 or 14 volts or whatever from the alternator through here. That will trigger the solenoid, which is just a switch itself, which will close and then allow this big fat amount of current to go to the starter motor. As soon as we release the switch, that will open the solenoid back up again and cut off the current to the starter, so that'll stop cranking. Now the only other thing we have to do is connect the coil, and we'll do it exactly the same way I showed in the first diagram. Basically, we'll take a positive lead. I'll probably actually connect it to the same terminal, but for the sake of the diagram, we'll just take another positive lead off here. We'll have an on-off switch to the ignition coil, like so. I hope that makes sense, and I may have this arrangement with the alternator slightly out of whack, but hopefully any mistakes I've made with this diagram will be obvious when we start putting it together, for real. Okay, so here we are, just about to do the wiring. I've got the solenoid down here, the coil here. Actually, why don't I just show you? So this is the back of the panel. You can see the coil at the top here, and the solenoid just below it. Hopefully you don't mind the fact that both the coil and the solenoid are a little crusty. They're the original ones off the vehicle, so I thought I may as well use the old one for this, and then I can just leave this set up. I think I already mentioned that I'm not going to make this a self-contained unit with, the battery and the fuel and everything on board. So while I'm using this as a run stand, the battery can just sit on the floor. So here are our 2 battery cables. One positive, one negative. So our earth will go here, and this means that the whole frame is now earthed to the negative terminal on the battery. Positive goes straight to the solenoid here. Well, we'll do it to this one actually. And you can just imagine the battery will be sitting like this. So from the other side of the solenoid here, we need another relatively fat cable. That should actually be fatter than this, but this is all I have. That's long enough. This is the cable which is going to fire our starter motor. Sorry, I know it's pretty dark around here, so the quality might be a little shitty, but this is where we hook that up to, the back of the starter, like so. And now the starter motor is earthed through the motor. So somewhere on the engine we need an earth, both for the starter and for the rest of the ignition system. Given that the starter is by far the biggest drawer of current, we will attach that earth strap right here. And I've got another terminal nice and close. That of course earths through the frame to that other terminal we saw earlier into the battery. Okay, so I've done the small wiring off camera. If we start down here at this terminal, I've got two wires coming off to power the switches, the ignition and the start switch. Remember, this has got nothing to do with the fact that it's attached to a solenoid. We're simply picking up the battery power from this lead here and transferring it to the small ones for the small switches. So if we start with the ignition switch, this is the back of the switch. When this is on, we want to feed power through here down to the ignition coil here. Now I haven't got it hooked up yet because I don't have a long enough ignition lead, but that lead will go over to the distributor on the motor, and this will go to the condenser in the motor. So in other words, when this wire through the switch is live, the engine has ignition. Now the second lead that runs up to the start switch, when we push this button, we need that to run current down to our solenoid to basically switch the solenoid on, which will connect these two terminals and thus put power through this chunky wire to the starter motor. Okay, so that's it. I will cable tie these up and that's our circuit complete. Again, apart from the two wires that run over to the distributor. Well guys, I guess that's about it. Normally at this point I'd do a big reveal, but of course the big reveal is going to happen in part 2 of the engine video on YouTube. So you'll have to wait till then to see this in all its glory. Thanks for watching guys, I really appreciate the support. And yeah, I hope you enjoyed this little video.